The first scream wasn't human. It was deeper, throaty, frantic, ripping through the still Arizona air like a warning shot. By the time Frank Martin dropped his wrench and sprinted out of the barn, the damage had already begun. Tank, the dog he didn't want but couldn't let go of, was charging straight into hell. The sky over Saguaro Valley had started out calm that morning. Not a cloud in sight, not a breeze across the dry, sun-beaten soil, just the usual rhythm of chores and the gentle scrape of Eli Martin's sneakers kicking dust along the edge of the field. Eli was only 7, but something about his soul felt older, aged by the silence of a mother who'd left and a father who never came back from deployment. He didn't talk much about either. He just hung close to Tank. The big sable German Shepherd was never far from him, a retired K9. Once a street-trained, bomb-sniffing legend, now just Eli's shadow, a dog with intelligent eyes and an uncanny sense for where danger might be hiding. That morning, Eli had wandered toward the old shed. It stood half-sunken in the soil near the tree line, the last thing left from a time before Frank had taken over the land. Tank's ears perked as the boy skipped closer to the door. "Eli," Frank called from the workshop, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Don't go near that shed. It's full of junk and probably spiders the size of your hand." Eli only laughed. Tank didn't. The dog stood stiff as a board, tail low, nose twitching. A growl rumbled in his throat, barely audible, but full of warning. His whole posture said one thing: something wasn't right. The moment shattered seconds later. From inside the shed, a violent buzzing erupted, like a chainsaw into the air. Then came the scream. Eli's scream. Frank's heart damn near stopped. He dropped everything and ran. By the time he got eyes on the scene, all he saw was a cloud, black and gold, moving like a living storm. Eli was inside it, his little arms flailing, his voice already breaking. "No!" Frank bellowed. But before he could move, Tank moved first. The German Shepherd tore across the field like a missile, straight into the swarm, straight toward Eli. And then everything disappeared in wings and sound. Frank stumbled forward, shouting, swatting the air. But the bees didn't care. It was as if the world had collapsed into chaos. All he could see now was fur thrashing, a boy's cries turning into choking gasps, and Tank taking the full weight of the attack, snapping, pouring, shielding the child beneath his own body. Frank made it through the storm, grabbed Eli, and ran like hell. They didn't have time for an ambulance. He threw both the boy and the dog into his pickup and tore down the road toward Dr. Sarah Mitchell's veterinary clinic, one of the few in the valley that took animals and sometimes people. Eli's face was already swelling. His neck blotched red. His breathing came in wheezing, stuttering bursts. Frank slammed the heel of his palm into the steering wheel, panic clenching his throat. "Hang on, kid. Hang on." Beside him, Tank lay motionless in the truck bed, covered in welts, blooded at the snout, but still alive. Still breathing, just barely. When Frank pulled into the gravel lot, Dr. Mitchell was already outside, alerted by the roaring engine and flying dust. One look at the battered dog and boy, and she knew. "Get him inside," she barked, pointing to Eli. "Tank too. I'll call urgent care to get a pediatric team on the line. We'll split the clinic in half if we have to." Frank had no idea how she did it, but within minutes, her modest vet center became a battlefield hospital. Eli was laid on an exam table, a veterinary technician administering oxygen, while another worked to remove stingers from Tank's matted fur. "He saved him," Frank whispered hoarsely, still gripping the truck steering wheel. "That dog went in after him." Dr. Mitchell nodded as she injected epinephrine into Eli's thigh. "Then let's make sure neither of them die for it." Love stories like this? Subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more real-life tales of bravery, healing, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. As minutes turned into an hour, Eli stabilized enough to be transferred by ambulance to Maricopa County Medical. Tank, however, remained at the clinic, barely conscious. His vitals were dropping, and the venom was wreaking havoc on his system. "He took the worst of it," Dr. Mitchell said solemnly. "Probably over 200 stings." Frank sat heavily on the wooden bench outside the exam room, his knuckles still raw from swatting at the air, his shirt soaked with Eli's blood and sweat and Tank's fur. He couldn't shake the image, the dog charging into that storm, throwing himself over the boy like a living shield. Tank had been his son's partner overseas, assigned to him in Kandahar. When Josh died in that convoy explosion, Tank had been shipped home along with his ashes. Frank hadn't wanted the dog. Too many memories, too much pain. But Eli had taken to him instantly. Maybe some things just don't need explaining. Later that evening, Eleanor Page, a local beekeeper and herbalist, arrived after hearing what had happened. "This wasn't just bad luck," she said, crouching near the shed with a flashlight and soil scoop. "Bees don't swarm like that unless they're defending something, or unless they've been poisoned." Frank frowned. Poisoned? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She collected samples, sniffed the air, touched a dark stain in the dirt with her gloved finger. Then she looked up slowly, eyes grim. "I think someone may have used a pesticide here. And if that's true, your dog knew it." Frank's breath hitched. "You mean Tank wasn't just reacting to the bees?" "I mean," Eleanor said, "he was trying to warn you long before the swarm ever hit. That dog didn't just save Eli, he might have been trying to save you, too." Back at the clinic, Dr. Mitchell leaned over Tank's body. The German Shepherd was barely responsive. Monitors beeped quietly beside him. Stingers still mattered at his ears and neck. She reached over, gently pressing her hand to his side. "Come on, soldier," she whispered. "You didn't come this far to quit now." Outside, Frank stood in the doorway, watching the dog breathe, watching the only thing left from his son's life fight for another child's, his grandson's. And something shifted in Frank Martin's chest. Not just grief, not just guilt, but a rising conviction. If Tank pulled through this, if there was even a sliver of a chance, Frank would fight, too. When Eli woke up in the pediatric ICU the next morning, the first word out of his swollen lips was Tank. Frank was slouched in the stiff vinyl hospital chair beside the bed. His coffee long cold, his back screaming from a night, but that one word, raspy and weak, snapped him upright. "He's hanging in there, kiddo," Frank said softly, moving closer and brushing a strand of sweat-soaked hair off Eli's forehead. "Dr. Mitchell's taking real good care of him." Eli blinked slowly, wincing as the oxygen tube tickled his nose. "Is he mad?" "I left him." Frank's chest tightened.
No, son.
"He never left you. He followed you into that mess. Protected you the whole time." The boy's eyes welled, but no tears fell. He was too dehydrated for crying, too shaken. The image of the black and gold swarm still danced behind his eyes every time he blinked. "He knew," Eli whispered. "Tank knew something bad was in that shed." Frank sat still. That line hadn't come from nowhere. "Say that again." Eli turned his head slowly, voice barely audible. "He barked at the shed every time I got close. Even yesterday, he wouldn't let me go near it. He was scared of it." Frank leaned back, rubbing his face. The shed, the buzzing, the barking, the smell. Tank's strange behavior for days. He chalked it up to boredom or instinct. But maybe Tank had smelled something. He was trained for that, wasn't he? Back at the veterinary clinic, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stared at the lab results on her screen with a furrowed brow. Tank's bone and creatinine levels were rising. His kidney function was dropping faster than she liked, and his hydration levels, despite the thaw, weren't bouncing back like they should have. "You stubborn boy," she muttered, glancing at the motionless German Shepherd on the table. "You're supposed to be responding better than this." She pulled a fresh stinger from his shoulder with tweezers, then ran a gloved hand down the length of his flank. "If you've got anything left in the tank, now's the time." Tank's tail twitched faintly. She blinked. "That's it. Give me more." Frank stopped by the clinic later that afternoon. He looked like a man caught between two wars, one inside a hospital room, the other inside his own memory. "How is he?" he asked as soon as he walked through the door. Dr. Mitchell stepped away from the exam room window and handed him a file. "Not good. His kidneys are failing. The venom load was extreme, likely over 300 stings. If this were a human, would have already transferred him to a nephrology ICU." Frank stared at the paper like it was written in another language. "Is there anything else we can do?" "There's one more option," she said, hesitating. "But it's experimental." Frank raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." She nodded toward the doorway where Eleanor Page, the beekeeper, waited. "You might want to hear it from her." Eleanor laid a small cooler on the metal table inside Dr. Mitchell's office. Her silver braid hung loose down her back. Her expression was dead serious. "This is purified melittin extract," she explained. It's the primary compound in bee venom. I've used it for years for my arthritis. Microdoses. It has anti-inflammatory and detox properties if used properly. Frank blinked. You want to give bee venom to the dog that almost died from bee venom? In theory, Eleanor replied. What nearly killed him might also help him. Dr. Mitchell folded her arms. It's risky. It hasn't been tested on dogs with acute venom overload, and we have no controlled studies. But, Eleanor added, if what I suspect is true, if he was also exposed to a chemical near that shed, then this might actually help his system clear it. Frank sat down slowly, processing. Let me get this straight. You think someone poisoned our shed? Eleanor nodded. Yesterday, I found residue in the soil, smelling like a neonicotinoid pesticide banned in this state. Extremely toxic to bees and illegal to use within 500 yards of an active hive. Frank's gut twisted. So someone knew about your bees and tried to destroy them, or tried to make your land unlivable, she added. Maybe even push you to sell. Frank stayed quiet during the ride back to the hospital. Eli had been napping when he left, but now the boy was sitting up in bed, sipping orange juice through a bendy straw. Did you check on him? He asked as soon as Frank walked in. Frank nodded. Yeah, I did. And he's tired, fighting hard. Did they give him the medicine yet? Frank paused. They're going to try, but it's risky. Eli looked down at his swollen arms. He's not afraid of risky. Dr. Mitchell administered the extract just before midnight. Frank stayed beside Tank, one hand resting gently on his back. The foreline trickled with the clear, slightly golden fluid. No change at first. Tank's heart rate held steady. His breathing labored, but consistent. Then, around 1:17 a.m., one of the monitors spiked gently upward. Dr. Mitchell's assistant leaned forward. Blood pressure just improved. By 2:45, his oxygen saturation rose by 5%. By sunrise, his kidney values began to shift. Not dramatically, but enough for Dr. Mitchell to finally exhale. He's responding, she said. It's small, but it's real. Frank pressed his forehead against the cold steel of the exam table and whispered, You're a hell of a soldier, boy. 2 days later, the sheriff stopped by the farm. Frank met him on the porch, a mug of black coffee in one hand, Eli's blanket still folded over his shoulder. Got a moment? Sheriff Travis asked. Frank nodded. Come on in. They sat at the kitchen table while Eli napped on the couch with cartoons playing low in the background. We sent the soil samples to the state lab, the sheriff said. Came back positive for imidacloprid. That's a class of pesticide. Not just banned, but banned for 10 years. Frank stared. So what happens now? An investigation. We'll pull nearby land registry records. See who has motive. Frank already knew. Agricor. The agribusiness giant had offered to buy his land 3 times in the past year. When he refused, the offers turned to threats. Then silence. Back at the clinic, Tank was eating soft food from Dr. Mitchell's hand. She smiled. There you go, big guy. You don't know it yet, but you just proved half a dozen scientists wrong. Tank's ears twitched. And you're about to scare the hell out of a corporation. That evening, Frank sat on the porch with Eli curled beside him, head resting on his chest. Can he come home soon? The boy asked. Maybe if he keeps getting better. Eli nodded, thoughtful. He's not just a dog. Frank looked down. He's our soldier. Frank swallowed hard. Yeah, kid. He sure is. It had been a week since the swarm. Tank was still at the clinic, hooked up to 4 fluids and monitored around the clock. But every day brought a little more strength back into his big, bruised body. His ears perked when Eli's voice came through the exam room door. His tail gave a soft wag when Frank brought in one of Eli's t-shirts to leave by his side. The boy sent his voice the way he whispered secrets into Tank's ear before bed. All of it mattered to the dog in a way words never could. He's fighting to come back, Dr. Mitchell told Frank one morning, wiping her hands on her scrub pants as she stepped out of the treatment room. For that kid. No question in my mind. Frank nodded. Yeah, and Eli's doing the same. Eli was recovering fast, but trauma had a way of hanging on even when the body caught up. The boy clung to Tank's favorite toy, an old knotted rope that smelled like dust and drool, and barely let it out of his sight. That morning, He asked Frank if he could go out to the shed. Frank stiffened. That's still a no, Bud. But what if it's important? Eli's blue eyes, pale against the bruising still fading from his face, looked up with stubborn insistence. Tank was barking at it before the bees came. What if there's something he was trying to tell us? Frank rubbed his temples. He hated how much sense that made coming from a 7-year-old. He glanced out toward the back of the property where the shed sat, quiet, weathered, half swallowed by weeds. Something was off about that place. Had been for weeks. All right, Frank finally said. We'll check it out together. The air around the shed was thick and still. Frank approached slowly, Eli a few steps behind, his little hand gripping the hem of Frank's shirt. The grass was oddly patchy in front of the shed, like something had been poured into the dirt. And the smell, faint but sharp, reminded Frank of motor oil mixed with bitter almonds. Eleanor's voice rang in his mind. If the bees swarmed like that, something triggered them. Frank crouched, poked a stick into the soil, and lifted it to his nose. It reeked of chemicals. Go back to the house, Eli, he said softly. Now. But now, Sheriff Travis returned the next afternoon. He stepped out of his department-issued truck, holding a plastic evidence bag and a clipboard. We found the same compound, imidacloprid, on the boots of a field inspector for Agricor, he said. Guy claims he was assessing soil conditions for possible partnership opportunities. Frank scowled. On land I didn't agree to sell. Exactly. They've been working around the edges of legality for years, but this is something else. Are you saying they trespassed and poisoned my land? Travis hesitated. We're not using the word poisoned yet, but yes, this is looking more and more deliberate. Someone was trying to drive you off this property. Frank exhaled through his nose, fist clenched. Can you arrest the guy? Not yet, the sheriff said, lowering his voice. We need more. But his boots were enough to open the door for a full investigation. Frank looked out over his sun-baked fields. The land wasn't just dirt to him. It was Josh's legacy, the last thing his son had touched before leaving for war. They weren't going to take it from him. Not now. Not ever. At the clinic, Tank had made it clear he was done lying around. The moment Dr. Mitchell walked in that morning, he stood, slow and stiff but proud, and let out a short bark. Well, look at you, she smiled, trying to prove you're ready to clock in again. Tank padded across the kennel and nuzzled the door latch with his snout. He wanted out. She opened the door cautiously, ready to catch him if he fell, but he didn't. He walked right to the door where Eli's shirt had been hanging and gave it a soft lick. Then he turned to her and waited. You want to see your boy, huh? The tail thumped once. Frank brought Eli to the clinic just after lunch. The boy nearly bounced out of the truck when he saw Tank standing on his own in the treatment area, tail wagging like a metronome. Tank, he shouted, rushing forward before Dr. Mitchell could even caution him. Tank took a step, then another, and then, unbelievably, met Eli halfway, pressing his nose against the boy's chest and letting out the gentlest whine. The clinic staff watched in silence, many of them tearing up. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a homecoming. They stayed in the clinic's recovery room for nearly an hour. Eli lay beside Tank on the padded floor, one arm across his thick shoulders, telling him about everything he'd missed, how the sheriff came by, how Grandma's pie had burned, how Frank had yelled at the TV again when the Cardinals lost. And Tank listened, head tilted, eyes soft, guard down like a soldier resting between battles. When they got back to the house that evening, Frank didn't take Eli inside right away. Instead, he walked over to the truck bed and pulled out something wrapped in a towel. Got something to show you, he said, kneeling in the dirt near the edge of the shed. What is it? Eli asked. Frank unwrapped the towel. Inside was a set of clear plastic evidence bags, each filled with clumps of soil stained black and gold with residual chemicals. State Lab sent the results this morning, Frank said. This stuff didn't just kill the bees. It could have contaminated our well water, and it was dumped right where you like to play. Eli's face paled. They were trying to hurt us. Frank nodded. Or scare us bad enough to leave. Eli looked toward the shed, then toward the horizon, then back at Frank. We are not leaving, are we? Frank smiled. Not a chance. Later that night, Frank sat on the porch with a cold beer and Tank at his feet, watching the stars come out one by one. Inside, Eli had fallen asleep, clutching Tank's rope toy, breathing soft and even. Frank reached down and rubbed the dog's ears. "I know I didn't want you at first," he said. "Thought you were a reminder of everything I lost." Tank blinked slowly. "But turns out you're what brought me back to what I still have." The screen door creaked open behind him. Eleanor stepped out, holding a folded sheet of paper. "From the university," she said. Results came in. The pesticides fingerprint matches stock used at Agricor's processing plant. Frank whistled low. "You just gave the sheriff the last piece of the puzzle." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Now they can stop denying and start answering questions." Frank looked down at Tank. "You hear that, boy? You sniffed out a crime ring with your nose." Tank let out a low huff, almost a chuckle. The next morning came with heat, early and thick, baking the Arizona desert ground before the sun had fully crested the horizon. But even at 6 a.m., Frank Martin was up, boots laced, coffee in hand, and eyes trained on the dirt road winding toward his house. He didn't like how quiet it had gotten. The media hadn't picked up the story yet, but word had spread fast through Saguaro Valley. Neighbors dropped off casseroles. A few ranchers offered to help with repairs. One even left a note that just said, "We believe you." But Frank didn't need belief. He needed proof, evidence, and he needed time. Because a storm was coming, and not the kind that brought rain. Inside, Eli sat cross-legged on the living room rug, Tank curled beside him, still weak, but stronger than yesterday. The two of them had barely left each other's side since the reunion. Eli read aloud from one of his dog books, stumbling over big words, but pushing through anyway. Tank listened, ears twitching every time Eli's voice cracked or broke. "You think bees can tell who the good guys are?" the boy asked suddenly. Frank looked up from the dining table. "Don't think they care." Eli frowned. "I think they do." By lunchtime, the first car rolled up. Frank stepped onto the porch just in time to see a sleek black SUV with tinted windows slow to a stop in front of the gate. Two men got out, dressed in crisp suits that looked absurd in the desert sun. One held a leather briefcase. The other was already walking toward the house. Frank didn't budge. He crossed his arms. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Mr. Martin," the man said smoothly, pulling off designer sunglasses. "I'm David Mercer, Regional Operations for Agricor. This is my associate, Mr. Riggs." Frank didn't shake the offered hand. "You're trespassing." "We are here to resolve this peacefully," Mercer continued, smiling like a salesman. "We heard about the unfortunate incident involving your grandson and your dog. Tragic. But we believe we can help. You can help by getting off my land." Mercer's smile didn't falter. "We are prepared to make a new offer. Substantial enough to relocate your family, cover your medical expenses, and ensure a stable future for that brave little boy inside." Frank's jaw tightened. "You've been snooping through my family's bills." "We have access to public records," Riggs cut in. "We know things have been difficult since your son passed. This land's not worth what it used to be. Wouldn't it be better for everyone to move on?" That did it. Frank stepped forward, voice flat and low. "Get off my porch." But it wasn't his voice that stopped them. It was the sudden sound of growling. Low, deep, steady. Tank had appeared at the door. His fur bristled, his stance tense. He stood half in shadow, half in sunlight, but every muscle in his body screamed alert. "Whoa, now," Riggs said, taking a step back. "Funny," Frank said, keeping his eyes locked on Mercer. "He only reacts like that when he smells something wrong." The men left eventually, but the moment their SUV disappeared down the road, Frank turned to Tank. "You knew, didn't you?" he muttered, kneeling beside him. "You smelled that guy. Same as before." Tank let out a sharp huff and looked toward the shed. It was all coming together now. That evening, Eleanor showed up with a clipboard, 2 jars of labeled soil, and fire in her eyes. "They're moving fast," she said, "because they're scared." Frank glanced over the documents. "You got something new." State inspectors found identical pesticide compounds at 3 other farms near Saguaro Valley. All of them refused to sell to Agricor. Frank whistled low. "So, it's not just us." "No," she said. "It's a pattern, and the Environmental Protection Agency is opening a federal case." Frank leaned back in his chair. "Good." Then Eleanor hesitated. There's something else. He raised an eyebrow. The state vet wants to test Tank's fur and bloodstream for traces of the pesticide. If he really was exposed, if he was the reason the bees attacked, then his body might have absorbed enough for them to identify. Frank rubbed the bridge of his nose. Will it hurt him? No, but it might finally prove that someone used him as an unknowing carrier. The next morning, Tank was quiet. Too quiet. He didn't follow Eli around the house like usual. Didn't bark at the mail truck. Didn't even sniff his food. Dr. Mitchell came over on short notice and ran another round of blood work. She frowned as she read the results. His kidneys are stressed again, she said. Not as bad as before, but is not out of the woods. Is it the venom? Frank asked. No, she said. More likely, it's trauma. He's on edge. Too much adrenaline, like he's waiting for something to happen. Frank sat beside the dog, running a calloused hand over his ears. Aren't we all, boy? That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He wandered the house in the dark, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a warning. Outside, the wind kicked up dust. The stars blinked, unbothered. Around 2:15 a.m., Tank stood up suddenly and growled at the front door. Frank stiffened. What is it? The dog didn't move, just stared, locked in. Frank grabbed the shotgun from behind the kitchen cabinet and peered out the window. Nothing. Then, from the far end of the property, headlights flickered, and a figure moved along the fence line. Stay here, Frank whispered to Tank. Guard Eli. Then he stepped out into the dark. What he found near the shed wasn't a person, but it was a message. A dead beehive, smashed and leaking, lay at the foot of the shed door, and beside it, nailed crudely into the wall, was a piece of plywood with the words, "Sell or suffer." Frank's heart slammed against his ribs. They weren't done. The next morning, Eleanor drove Tank into town herself for testing. By noon, the EPA had a full forensic team out, walking the property. And by 3 p.m., Sheriff Travis arrived with a warrant and 2 deputies. You ready for this? He asked Frank. Frank looked toward the house where Eli stood at the window, holding Tank's rope toy. You tell me. The knock on Agricorps regional office came just before dinner. Mercer answered the door in a golf shirt and slacks, confused but smiling. That smile didn't last. You're under investigation for environmental violations, unlawful use of restricted pesticides, and criminal trespass, one of the agents said as he was handcuffed. Mercer turned to Riggs. You said we were covered. Riggs didn't answer. Tank had already identified both their scents. The rest would be up to the courts. Back at home, Eli wrapped his arms around Tank's neck and whispered, "We're safe now." Frank stood on the porch, watching the wind move through the trees, knowing it wasn't quite over. But it was a start. They had fought. They had survived. And they weren't letting go. 3 days after Agricorps' regional office was raided, the story finally broke. Not just in the county paper, but statewide. The evening news showed a drone shot of the shed on Frank Martin's land and ran the headline, Arizona boy and retired K9 uncover illegal pesticide plot. That part wasn't entirely true. Eli hadn't uncovered anything. Tank had, and that made all the difference. Frank turned off the TV before the news anchor could butcher any more details. He walked outside, coffee in one hand, and watched as Tank padded slowly across the yard toward the garden, still stiff, but moving with more purpose than he had in days. Eli was crouched beside the dog, gently scratching his ears, chattering about something involving rocket-powered bicycles. Frank smiled. If there was ever a picture of healing, it was those two together, boy and dog, linked by something deeper than words. But beneath the quiet, Frank felt the hum of unfinished business. Agricorps had money, lawyers, influence. They might have been knocked off balance, but they weren't going away quietly. By mid-morning, 2 government SUVs pulled up the long dirt road. Frank recognized one of the men from the EPA's earlier visit. Agent Harmon, tall, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed. The other wore a navy windbreaker with yellow block letters, FBI. Mr. Martin, Agent Harmon said as they stepped onto the porch. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions? Frank nodded, motioning them inside. Eli stayed with Tank on the porch, but the boy's ears clearly stayed tuned. Inside, the agent spread documents across Frank's kitchen table, lab reports, satellite images, financial statements, and one blurry photo of Thomas Riggs, Agricorps field specialist, talking to a man in a warehouse full of chemical drums. We believe Agricorp's regional unit was operating what we call a shadow acquisition scheme, Harmon explained. They'd approach resistant landowners, offer to buy their property. If that didn't work, they'd create pressure, chemical sabotage, environmental disruption, even intimidation. Frank leaned forward. And my family was one of those targets. Exactly. But thanks to your dog's alert behavior and the samples we collected, we have a chain of evidence. The FBI agent spoke next. We are preparing a federal racketeering case. But we need one more thing. Frank's jaw tightened. What? A clear demonstration that Tank's alert was valid, recognized under K9 protocols. If we can validate his detection, it strengthens the case. Frank hesitated. He's retired. He's been through hell. We know, Agent Harmon said gently. But you've already got half the state watching. That dog saved a life. Now he might help save a lot more. Later that night, Frank sat on the porch with Eli and Tank. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting orange streaks across the fields. Grandpa, Eli asked. Yeah. Is Tank going to be a hero? Frank looked down at the dog resting between them. He already is. No, I mean like in front of people, on TV, like a police dog again. Frank hesitated. He might be. The FBI wants him to do a demonstration. Show how he found the bad stuff. Eli smiled. He'll do it. You think so? I know. The dog stirred at the sound of his name, then rolled onto his side, letting Eli scratch his belly. It was the most relaxed Frank had seen him in weeks. Yeah, Frank whispered. Maybe you're right. 2 days later, Tank stood beside Frank on the grassy lot behind the sheriff's office. A small crowd had gathered, county officials, state inspectors, 2 FBI agents, and Sheriff Travis, looking more nervous than usual in front of the camera crew from Channel 8 News. On the far side of the field sat 5 identical metal toolboxes, spaced evenly apart. One of them had been prepared with a trace amount of the banned pesticide, enough to register a scent, not enough to harm. Frank leaned down next to Tank and gave a firm pat to his shoulder. All right, partner, just like old times. Tank looked up, alert, focused. When Frank gave the signal, the German Shepherd trotted forward, nose to the ground. He passed the first box, then the second, then stopped suddenly at the third. He sat down beside it, gave a short bark, and looked back at Frank. A perfect alert. Applause broke out across the lot. Tank didn't wag his tail, didn't strut. He simply walked back to Frank and sat beside him like it was no big deal. But it was. That demonstration tipped the scale. By the end of the week, Agricorp's board suspended all regional managers. Several executives were subpoenaed, and Riggs, he flipped. With a plea deal on the table, he confessed to everything: the pesticide dumping, the plan to sabotage local bee populations, the threat scrawled on Frank's shed. We were under orders, he said in court, to create urgency for sale. What they created was something else entirely: a movement. Donations poured into a GoFundMe campaign started by a local teacher. Enough to cover Eli's medical bills, enough to settle Tank's treatments, enough for Frank to fix the fence lines, update the well, and even install a proper AC unit in the house for the first time in 20 years. But none of it changed Frank's mind. He wasn't selling. Not now, not ever. One crisp September morning, a white envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to Tank Martin, care of Eli Martin. Inside was a letter from the Arizona Department of Agriculture. We are proud to honor Tank, retired K9, for extraordinary service in the protection of Arizona families, land, and environmental integrity. His actions helped expose one of the largest illegal pesticide operations in state history. Enclosed is a commemorative medal and certificate of service. Tank sniffed the medal once, sneezed, and trotted off with his rope toy. Eli taped the certificate above his bed. That night, Frank grilled burgers while Eleanor shucked corn on the porch. Eli ran around the yard with a pack of neighbor kids, Tank trotting along behind them like a worn-out chaperone. Sheriff Travis stopped by, a six-pack in hand and an easy smile. You ever think, he said to Frank as they stood by the grill, that one dog and one little boy could bring down a corporate Goliath? Frank chuckled. Never in my wildest. Think you'll testify if it goes federal? I will, Frank said, flipping a patty. Tank too, if they let him. He's got more credibility than half the witnesses I've seen. Frank raised his beer to the dog, who wouldn't let go. They clinked bottles. As the sun sank below the horizon, Eli curled up beside Tank under the porch lights. The boy's voice drifted through the air as he spoke to his dog like always. "You're not just a hero, you know. You're my best friend." Tank let out a soft groan and placed his head on the boy's lap. Somewhere deep in the yard, crickets sang. The sky darkened. And for the first time in weeks, everything felt still. Autumn came early to Saguaro Valley that year. The skies took on a softer blue. The mornings held a quiet bite. The cottonwoods turned gold along the creek bed. And for the first time in a long time, Frank Martin felt something close to peace settle over his porch. Tank lay beside his rocking chair, eyes closed, ears twitching at the sound of leaves dancing in the breeze. His body had filled back out since the attack, stronger now, steadier. But the fire in his eyes had changed. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was something else, a survivor, a sentinel. Family. Inside the house, Eli sat at the kitchen table with homework spread out like a war zone. A glue stick rolled off the edge, followed by a crayon, then an elbow. "Careful, Bud," Frank called from the porch, hearing the chaos. "I'm making a poster," Eli shouted. "It's for school. We're supposed to write about the bravest thing we've ever seen." Frank smiled. "Let me guess. It's about Tank." Eli confirmed. "But it's also about you and the bees and Eleanor and the sheriff and the bad guys and justice." "That's a lot for one poster." "I know," Eli said proudly. "That's why it's 3 pages." Later that day, a letter arrived from the University of Arizona's veterinary school. It had been sent to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, but addressed to both her and Frank. It read, "Based on the groundbreaking use of targeted bee venom therapy in the canine's extraordinary survival, we are adding Tank's case to our national veterinary curriculum on trauma recovery and chemical exposure. Thank you for reminding us that healing can come from unlikely places and that sometimes the best medicine is loyalty, courage, and love." Dr. Mitchell called Frank right after reading it. "He's going to be in textbooks," she said, half laughing. "Your dog, in textbooks." Frank leaned on the kitchen counter, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned." The town held a small ceremony the following weekend at the community center. It wasn't fancy, just folding chairs and a potluck buffet, but the entire town showed up. Sheriff Travis read a proclamation. Eleanor gave a short speech about pollinators and land stewardship. The mayor, who usually didn't say much, presented Eli and Tank with matching medallions that read, "Guardians of the Valley." Eli wore his proudly. Tank tried to eat his. After the ceremony, as the crowd trickled out into the parking lot under string lights in a desert sky, a man approached Frank, tall, late 30s, dressed like he hadn't planned on speaking, but had something on his chest. "Mr. Martin," he said quietly. "Yeah." "I used to work for Agricorps," the man said. "Not here, up in Cochise County. I left a year ago. Couldn't handle the pressure. But what you did here, what your dog did, it meant something. It changed something." Frank studied the man's face for a long moment, then nodded. "Thanks for saying so." The man offered a hesitant handshake, then disappeared into the night. On the drive home, Eli fell asleep in the back seat with Tank's head resting in his lap. Frank glanced at them in the rearview mirror, heart heavy and light all at once. So much had been nearly lost. So much had been saved. 2 weeks later, a reporter from the Arizona Republic visited the farm to do a follow-up story. She wore hiking boots and carried a notepad, asking smart questions while dodging Tank's attempts to steal her pen. "What's next for you all?" she asked. Frank looked around at the property. Fresh fence posts, new paint on the porch, and wildflowers planted around the edges of the once poisoned soil. "Well," he said slowly, "we are staying right here. Got work to do. This place needs watching, and I figure Eli and Tank are just the guys to do it." "And you?" she asked. He looked toward the shed, now converted into a learning space for Eli's science projects, with solar-powered bee boxes nearby and a weather station mounted to the roof. "I'm just the backup." Eli smiled. "That's right." Frank laughed, proud that his son was so proud of him and Tank barked, once. That afternoon, Frank watched from the porch as Eli ran drills with Tank in the yard. Not formal training, just boy and dog moving together in perfect rhythm. Eli would hide a small container in the grass, then call out, "Go get it." Tank would sniff it out within seconds, bark once, then sit, tail wagging. Each time, Eli clapped like it was the 4th of July. Frank clapped his hands. "You're going to wear that dog out," Frank called. "He likes it," Eli called back. Tank trotted up, holding the little box proudly in his jaws. And, for a moment, the world was just right. That night, Frank found Eli asleep in bed, with Tank curled up tightly beside him. The boy's arm draped over the dog's back like a favorite blanket. On the nightstand sat a picture of Josh, Eli's dad, smiling in uniform with Tank standing beside him, snapped somewhere by a base in Afghanistan years ago. Frank looked at the photo, then at Eli, then at the sleeping pair, and whispered, "You kept your promise, son." He kissed Eli's forehead and turned off the light. Eli smiled. And so did Tank. Weeks passed, then months. The lawsuit against Agricor grew into a class action case involving 6 farms. The EPA completed a full cleanup of Frank's land, and 3 others, citing intentional environmental sabotage and public health risks. Tank continued to heal, physically and emotionally. He didn't flinch at bees anymore, just gave them a weary glance, then walked the other way. Eli brought home straight A's for the first time ever. And, Frank, he built a bench under a cottonwood tree by the creek, right where the sun hit just before dusk. Some evenings he sat there alone, other times with Eli. Tank, but always with a full heart. One evening, just before Christmas, Eleanor stopped by, with a wrapped box and a knowing smirk. "What's this?" Frank asked. "Just open it," she said. Inside was a small wooden plaque, hand-carved, simple, elegant. "The dog who wouldn't let go, in honor of Tank, for loyalty beyond training, protection without hesitation, and love without condition." Frank didn't say anything for a long while, that moment. Then he nodded. "Thank you." "It's nothing," she said. Eli grinned. "It's everything." Frank smiled back, glad that his grandson was so glad of him, and of Tank, so proud. And so did Tank. Thank you all so much for following the journey of Eli, Tank, and Frank through this emotional, true-to-life story. Heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Some wear badges, some wear boots, some walk on pads with paws, with old scars and unshakable hearts. And now, we hope Tank's touched yours, ours. Tell us about Tank's story in the comments below. Have you ever known an animal who refused to give up on you? Who was your Tank? We'd love to hear your story. Let's keep ours.